Nobody in the summer of 1940 climbed into a Hurricane or a Spitfire to fight the Luftwaffe in the skies over England so that Neil Oliver fans could cough on other people 80 years later and make them sick. To suggest otherwise, it's an insult. I want to talk about war, but first, let's talk about Neil Oliver. Neil Oliver is a TV historian with much nicer hair than mine. He used to make TV programmes about the British coast and Vikings who came over here with their longships, their Norse mythology and superior leatherwork. But in recent years, Neil has ploughed a rather different furrow. It's hard to put your finger on exactly where it all started, but in 2019, he was telling Lorraine Kelly that since Britain had existed for, quote, 1,000,000 years and had been through all sorts of events like wars, civil wars, upheaval in the past, Brexit would be just fine long term. So we all needed to chill out and just be a bit more optimistic. When GB News was launched earlier this year, Neil was an early signing. In broadcasts since, he's taken to talking a lot about the war. Yes, he likes talking about the war. He's a big fan of the war and not so much of a fan of vaccinations and COVID. A few days ago, he conflated the two in spectacular style. "I declare that I am a free man," he told the cameras dramatically, born into a country where
I was taught that my freedom had been won for me by men and women who had fought and died to make it so.
Robust stuff. Apparently, because Mr. Oliver was born just 22 years after the end of the war, near miss, he knew people who were there and has therefore got some kind of unique insight to events. But having banged on about the Nazis and birds who need to live in freedom, apparently, or something like that, Neil delivered his killer line: "If my freedom means you might catch COVID from me,
then so be it. That's honestly how I see it."
So there you are. He then talked a bit more about the Battle of Britain and Spitfires and Winston Churchill, who it seems did all of that fighting so that Mr. Oliver could have the right to give us all COVID. And then his 5 minutes in the spotlight ends. Thankfully. Mine hasn't, because there's a lot to unpack there. But let's start with this thing about people fighting and dying in wars to protect Neil Oliver's right to give us all COVID. Both wars, but the Second World War in particular, have become something akin to a kind of religion in this country. Barely a week goes by that someone isn't popping up to tell us that the hundreds of thousands of people who died in both wars and the millions of people who fought did so to protect our freedom or to give our kids the right to be bossed about by Nigel Farage. It's a lot of nonsense. The war was constantly invoked in Brexit. Apparently, it would have made the Spitfire pilots cry that we joined the EEC and EU, despite millions of veterans voting for just that in the 1975 referendum. In recent years, Winston Churchill in particular has become a sort of battleground, with the statue erected in his honour being weaponised by the Tory right and the likes of Boris Johnson to make some point about how we should all be proud of him because otherwise we aren't proper patriotic Britons and that we hate this country or some such nonsense like that. It's easy to invoke the war, particularly if you weren't there, because the imagery is familiar to everyone and the narrative has become, well, as I say, a faith. It's the trump card in the 21st century British political landscape, pulled out at whim to win arguments over membership of the EU or COVID-19 or the increasingly tedious culture war. Early on in the pandemic, ministers were forever invoking the Blitz spirit and Dunkirk, those twin sacred magic potions that run deep in the veins of the people of this island nation, apparently, and which Neil Oliver seemed to be summoning up in his very peculiar piece to camera. In the process, the actual history, the actual sequence of events, the actual sentiments of people who fought in both world wars gets brushed aside in an orgy of appropriation and cosplaying. There's too much to unpack in one go, but let's just cremate one dangerous and stupid notion, and it's the one Neil Oliver went on about most of all. This idea that people fought in World War II for your and my freedom. It's complete nonsense. Nobody in 1939 was talking about the freedom of people in 2021 to refuse vaccinations that would speed a pandemic to its end. Nobody in the summer of 1940 climbed into a Hurricane or a Spitfire to fight the Luftwaffe in the skies over England so that Neil Oliver fans could cough on other people 80 years later and make them sick. To suggest otherwise, it's an insult. And likewise, the million-odd men of the British Empire who died in World War I did not go to their muddy or violent ends in order to preserve the freedom of people 100 years later. That wasn't even at the bottom of their to-do list. They went in large part because they had been conditioned into believing that they needed to fight for king and country. And in large part, most of them probably didn't understand the complex geopolitical situation that had led to war. And in very large part, they went because they were told they had to go. Let's not forget that half of all the men who fought in the so-called Great War were conscripted. They were ordered to the front. It was such a scandal at the time that there were mass demonstrations against it in Trafalgar Square. But everybody seems to have forgotten that. This idea that everyone marched happily off to war between 1914 and 1918 is fake history. It's a myth. And it's every bit as big as the one that says that Winston Churchill was a man of the people who believed in freedom. You know, Winston Churchill, the freedom fighter who fought against the Nazis, also opposed Indian independence tooth and nail for 30 years. A lover of freedom he was not. He was a defender of the British Empire. We need to stop this war nonsense, this war obsession and this war religion. And we need to hold politicians and the like of GB News to account for their ahistorical and frankly insulting takes on those events. There's a lot of guff written about the war, a lot of guff written about Blitz spirit. But what is true is that for the most part, people did come together out of desperation to fight the common enemy between 1939 and 1945. And even as they did, a lot of idiots moaned about it. They objected to the blackout restrictions that were there to protect them. They didn't like the smell of the gas masks, and so they refused to carry them around. They didn't like the rationing that was necessary to get the country through the war, and many got round it by going to the black market. An awful lot of people in Britain, particularly early on, didn't view Germany as the enemy. They wanted to appease the Nazis and just get on with their lives as Hitler ran riot on the continent. But you know, weirdly, the current crop of coronavirus collaborators don't make that point. They feel they're on the side of the people who fought the enemy, not the people who enabled the enemy. And as for the people who are spewing out misinformation and enabling the virus still and prolonging this disaster, well, you're not helping. You're not helping this country move forward. You're not helping things run to their end. Stick to the Vikings, Mr. Oliver. We liked it when you talked about the Vikings. And better still, You knew what you were talking about.
In these dark times that we find ourselves in, it's all too easy to feel passive and disengaged and hopeless. But there is something you can do. If you like the sound of a fearless, independent media outlet really trying to shine a light where the mainstream doesn't, then do sign up to Byline TV. You can hit the join button on YouTube or subscribe on Patreon. You can be part of driving meaningful change.